Widowed father rescues a lady in chains, unaware she's a wealthy baroness. Jack Mercer didn't ride fast anymore. Not since the fire. He lived quiet now, with nothing but his 10-year-old son Ben, an old mule, and the land that stretched wide and silent around their small cabin. His hands were worn, skin dark from sun, fingers rough with work. There had been a time he laughed easy, talked often, but grief had changed that. He had buried his wife 5 winters ago when fever took her in 3 nights, and ever since, the words he used were few, the smiles even fewer. That morning, Jack was returning from the river with a small bag of fish slung over his saddle. The sky was gray, low clouds pressing like heavy thoughts, and the wind was too still. His mule, Dusty, made a soft grunt and paused at the edge of the woods. Jack felt it too. Something was off. A crow screamed overhead and flew low across the trees. Jack got down, his boots crunching over dry needles, his eyes narrowing. He pushed aside a hanging branch, stepped forward, and saw the trail. Broken branches, footprints in the mud, a length of rope half buried under leaves. He followed the signs until he heard it, a sharp sound, metal on wood, then a breath, strained and near. He moved slowly, carefully. Behind a fallen log, half hidden in brambles, was a woman. She was on her side, wrists chained, one leg twisted under her. Her dress was torn, stained with dirt and blood, and her face was hidden beneath tangled hair. The chain had been fastened to an iron stake in the ground, but it looked rushed, like whoever left her there had plans to return. She didn't move when Jack approached, only flinched when the shadow of him fell across her. Jack knelt beside her, his voice low, his hand not touching yet. She didn't speak, but he saw the fear in her eyes, wide and distant. He pulled a small hammer from his saddlebag and broke the chain free from the stake. She cried out softly, not from pain but from relief or maybe confusion. He lifted her gently, surprised at how light she was. She didn't speak, didn't resist, only let her head fall against his chest like she had no more strength left to fight or flee. Jack carried her to his mule, placed her across the saddle, and began the slow ride home. Ben saw them from the porch and stood quickly, eyes wide. Jack gave him a small nod, and the boy didn't ask questions. They laid her in the extra bed, the one his wife had made before she passed. Jack cleaned her hands, wrapped the cuts, placed a wet cloth on her head. Her eyes opened once during the night, but she didn't speak, only stared at the ceiling like it held a memory she was afraid to face. Jack sat nearby, not speaking, not sleeping. The cabin was quiet except for the fire and the sound of rain beginning to tap at the roof. In the morning, she was still, her breathing soft but steady. Jack made coffee and fried bread, and when she finally sat up, she looked at him without fear this time, just tiredness. He asked no questions, offered her a plate. She ate slowly, her hands shaking, her lips chapped. When she finished, she looked at him and tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat. Jack only nodded once and said, "You're safe now." And that was enough. The days passed quietly. She didn't say her name, and Jack didn't ask again. He noticed the way she moved, careful and practiced, like someone used to being watched. She would sometimes stand by the door and stare at the trees for a long time, as if searching for something or someone. Then gave her space, but once he placed a small wooden bird on her table, the one he had carved with his father. She picked it up gently, turning it over in her hand, and gave him the smallest smile. Jack saw it, and something in him stirred, something he thought had dried up with his grief. He fixed the broken fence, cleaned the tool shed, did the things he always did. But now he did them with an ear tuned to her footsteps, with eyes that sometimes glanced at the window to see if she was near. One afternoon, she followed him to the field. She wore one of his old coats, too large for her frame, and held a small basket to gather kindling. They didn't speak, but worked side by side. The sun peeked through the clouds that day, casting golden light across the grass. She paused once, hand to her forehead, and Jack saw a scar near her temple, half hidden by her hair. He didn't ask. He only offered her his canteen. She drank and nodded thanks. That evening, she sat by the fire while Ben read from an old book. Her eyes were fixed on the flames, her hands folded in her lap. When the boy fell asleep in the chair, Jack carried him to bed. When he came back, she looked at him and said softly, "Why did you help me?" He took a long breath before answering, "Because someone had to." She turned her face away, but he saw the tears fall. She didn't sob, just let them run, quiet and slow. Jack didn't move closer, didn't speak. He knew some things were better left to finish on their own. That night, she didn't sleep much, and neither did he. But something had changed, something small and unseen. The silence between them was different now, not empty, but waiting. The next few days passed with the rhythm of early trust. The woman, still unnamed, began to move more freely around the cabin. She helped with breakfast, though her hands trembled when she cracked the eggs, as if she was still waking up from a world that never gave her the chance to do such simple things. Jack didn't ask her where she had come from, who had chained her, or what she had left behind. He simply made space, clearing paths in his quiet life so she could walk through without feeling like a stranger. Ben, curious but gentle, began to speak more when she was around, telling stories of schoolbooks and animals, always watching her face to see if she would smile. Sometimes she did, just a little. The land around the cabin stretched calm and endless, with wildflowers starting to bloom along the path that led to the river. She followed that path once, not too far, but far enough that Jack stood on the porch until he saw her return. When she came back, her boots were muddy and her eyes were different, clearer, like she had remembered how to breathe. Jack noticed her watching the sky more often, tilting her head toward the light like she was measuring the weight of freedom. One evening, she stood outside alone, coat wrapped tight around her shoulders, and watched the sun dip low over the hills. Jack joined her without a word. They stood side by side, saying nothing, but the silence was full. It held understanding, the kind that didn't need to be spoken. That night, she cooked the stew. It was too salty, and the potatoes were half raw, but Jack ate every bite. When she looked at him, unsure, he nodded once and said it was good. She didn't smile, but her hands relaxed. In the mornings, she began to hum. Just soft sounds, not songs with words, but notes that floated in the air like threads of something once forgotten. Jack heard her once through the open window while he was splitting wood, and he paused, letting the sound soak into the silence. Inside, she was scrubbing the floor with a brush, sleeves rolled up, hair tied back. Her cheeks were flushed from work, and her eyes were focused. She looked like someone claiming a space, not just hiding in it. That afternoon, she found a small mirror behind the cupboard and stared at her reflection for a long time. Jack saw her from the doorway but said nothing. She traced the edge of her face with her fingers, as if trying to remember the shape of herself. Later that day, she asked to borrow scissors. Jack handed them to her. That evening, her hair was shorter, uneven but strong, no longer hiding her eyes. She had changed something, and it showed in the way she stood. The first time she asked to go to town, Jack hesitated. It wasn't that he didn't trust her. It was the fear in her voice when she tried to sound brave. She said she wanted to buy flour, but Jack knew it wasn't about the flour. It was about control, about stepping back into a world that once hurt her. He offered to go with her, and she nodded. In town, people stared but didn't speak. She wore a plain dress, one of his late wife's, and kept her head down. Jack stayed close, carrying the basket, watching for signs of fear. She bought thread, salt, and a tin of buttons. When they passed the general store's piano, she stopped, fingers brushing the keys like a secret. The sound startled her, a soft note in a dusty room, but she didn't run. She only stepped back, quiet, steady. On the way home, she sat in the wagon without speaking, her hands folded tight in her lap. Jack let the silence ride with them. That night, she sat at the table and stitched fabric with careful hands, and though she didn't say anything about the piano, she hummed that same note again and again. Days turned into weeks. The land began to warm, and Ben spent more time chasing frogs by the creek. Jack and the woman worked the garden together, planting small things that needed time and patience to grow. She found joy in the feel of dirt, in the act of placing seeds into earth like small promises. Jack saw the way her face softened when she worked, the way she looked at the cabin like it belonged to her, too. One morning, while dusting the shelf, she found an old book of pressed flowers. She turned the pages gently, stopping at one that held a sprig of lavender. She placed it in a jar on the windowsill, and from that day, the house felt fuller, like it remembered how to breathe. It was on a warm afternoon that her past tried to return. A rider came, dust trailing behind him, a stranger too clean for these parts. Jack met him at the edge of the property, rifle resting on his shoulder. The man asked questions about a missing noblewoman, a lady of high birth, last seen heading west. Jack said he hadn't seen anyone. The man's eyes scanned the cabin behind Jack, resting for a moment on the open window. Inside, the woman stood still, not hiding, but watching. She saw the man, and something in her face changed. Not fear. Something harder. She stepped out onto the porch, her hand steady. Jack turned, ready to stop her, but she shook her head gently and stepped beside him. The man stared. Then his mouth opened slightly. He said her name, not the one she had spoken, but another, longer, heavier. She answered with a voice that carried no shame. She said that name no longer mattered, that the chains had been broken, and she had buried what was left of that life. The man tried again, spoke of duty, of family, of bloodlines and inheritance. She listened and then turned to Jack, meeting his eyes. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. She turned back to the stranger and said she would not return. Not now. Not ever. The man left in silence, and the dust followed him into the distance. She watched until the dust faded, then walked back inside, her back straight, her hands relaxed. Jack followed her and closed the door behind them. That night, she took off the last glove she had always worn, placed it gently in a drawer, and let her hand rest bare on the table. The days that followed moved with a new kind of quiet, not the silence of hiding, but the stillness of belonging. The woman, who now answered only to the name Clara, had stopped looking over her shoulder. She no longer jumped at every gust of wind or flinched at the creak of old wood. The past had come to her doorstep and left empty-handed, and that changed something deep in her. She began to hum more often, not just in the kitchen or while folding clothes, but outside too, walking along the edge of the field or sitting on the porch with Ben as he whittled sticks into shapes only he understood. Jack watched it happen like a season changing, slow, steady, and inevitable. He saw the color return to her face, the way her steps grew lighter, the way she laughed now and then, soft and real. She still didn't talk much about what had come before, and Jack never pressed her. All he needed to know was that she was here, and that was enough. Ben had started calling her Miss Clara without anyone telling him to. One morning, she helped him fix a torn satchel, her hands moving fast and sure, like sewing was something she had once done in another life, long before chains and forests. Jack noticed the way she looked at the boy, with a gentleness that came from deep understanding, as if she saw her own lost childhood in him, and wanted to protect what was left of his. They began reading together in the evenings, Jack sitting nearby, his boots crossed, listening to the sound of her voice moving through the worn pages of old books. Her tone was calm, steady, like water flowing over stones, and Ben always fell asleep halfway through. Jack never said it, but sometimes he stayed awake just to hear her read. Spring stretched out around them, warm and generous. The garden grew, the hens laid more eggs, and the days lasted longer than the nights. Clara began sewing curtains for the windows, using scraps she found in old trunks and pieces Jack's wife had saved years ago. When she finished, she stood back and looked at them like someone laying the final brushstroke on a painting. The cabin looked different now, not bigger or newer, just lived in, like it had a new heart beating inside its walls. Jack fixed the porch rail and added a second chair. Most mornings, they sat together with coffee, saying little, watching the sunrise slow across the hills. The silence between them had grown warm. It no longer needed to be filled, only shared. One afternoon, Clara found a piano in town, forgotten in the back of the feed store, keys yellowed and body scuffed by years of dust. She touched it only once, and something in her face flickered, a memory or a promise. Jack couldn't tell. That evening, without saying a word, he hitched the wagon and went back for it. When he returned, she stood in the doorway, eyes wide, lips parted in disbelief. He didn't explain, didn't ask if she wanted it. He just wheeled it into the cabin and placed it by the window. She stood staring at it for a long time, then sat down and ran her fingers across the keys. The first sound that came was broken, off-key, like breath caught in a throat. But the second was clearer, and the third brought tears to her eyes. She played something quiet, unfinished, and Jack sat in the chair beside her, eyes closed, letting the notes fill the space like morning light. After that, she played every evening. The music was never loud, never fast. It was soft and careful, like someone remembering how to speak without fear. It filled the corners of the house and drifted outside into the night air. Even the birds seemed to pause sometimes to listen. One morning, she found Jack mending a broken drawer and placed a hand on his shoulder, light but certain. He didn't move, only looked up and saw something in her eyes that hadn't been there before, not just gratitude, but peace. That afternoon, they walked to the ridge beyond the barn, the place where the sky felt closest and the world opened wide. They stood there as the sun fell low, when tugging gently at their clothes, and Clara took off the necklace she always wore, the last piece of her old life. Without a word, she buried it under a stone at the base of a tree and stood up straighter than before. That night, she cooked a simple meal, and after they ate, she poured tea for the three of them. Ben talked about a rabbit he had almost caught, and Jack listened with quiet pride. Clara laughed, and her hand brushed Jack's across the table. It was small, accidental, but neither of them pulled away. When the boy went to bed, Jack and Clara remained, sitting by the fire. She looked at the flames, then at him, and he saw the question in her eyes. Not about the past, but about what could come next. He reached over, slow and sure, and took her hand. It was the first time he had touched her like that, not as rescue or comfort, but as something steady, something shared. She didn't speak, only leaned her head against his shoulder, and they stayed that way until the fire burned low and the night grew quiet. A week later, they married under the oak tree near the river, with only Ben in the wind to witness it. Clara wore a simple dress she had sewn herself, and Jack wore his cleanest shirt. There were no vows spoken, no rings exchanged. Their life had already said everything words could not. They returned to the cabin and shared bread, music, and laughter, and for the first time in many years, Jack felt the weight of grief lift from his chest. Clara no longer looked like a woman lost, and Jack no longer moved like a man waiting for the end. They were simply two people who had survived enough to know what mattered. In the months that followed, Clara planted herbs by the window and began writing in a small book each night. Jack built a bench beneath the tree where they had stood, and sometimes they sat there watching Ben run through the grass. They didn't speak much of the past, not because it didn't matter, but because it didn't own them anymore. They had built something new, not grand, not loud, but honest and quiet and whole. One evening, Clara stood at the piano, playing a tune that was full and complete. Jack leaned in the doorway, arms crossed, watching her with eyes that no longer carried sorrow, but hope. She looked at him, smiled, and kept playing, and outside, the wind carried the sound across the hills like a promise made and kept. The lady in chains was gone. The Baroness was buried, and in her place stood a woman who had found her name again, not the one given by blood or title, but the one written in quiet days and shared mornings. Her name was Clara Mercer now, and she had finally come home.